Well, welcome everybody. Got a lot going on. A lot of people out there trying to mock me, trying to, throw darts at me. And I was told that this would happen. And I followed a couple of other investigations, and I've seen that, when the evidence is stacked against the people that do not want to go to prison, that what do? They try to attack the character of the person rather than actually attacking the evidence that that person is presenting. So I think these attacks have started and they're just going to continue. But, that tells us that we're getting over the target. When they were flying, air raid missions in World War II, when they started getting shot up, they knew they were over the target. That's when they unloaded their bombs. And so now, kind of what I want to do is I want to walk through the similarities between the Tupac and the Biggie murders. Because I've been told by somebody very close to this that if you solve one murder, you solve both of them because it was the same people involved. Doesn't mean the same shooter, because they learned something from the first murder and they made an improvement in the second murder. It was an experience modification. So in the Tupac murder, you have the clock starting when the reset happens when Tupac and Suge are pulled over on the strip. And they're pulled over on the strip because their music is too loud. Now, fight night, Las Vegas, how many people get pulled over because their music is too loud? A little bit of a kind of weird, huh? What, is that really even possible to get pulled over because your music is too loud on fight night in Las Vegas on the strip? So that's the reset. That's when they make sure everybody's in place and they're going to let the cars go and they're going to do the hit, okay? Well, what's the reset? What's the clock that gets set on the Biggie murder? Well, I would just say that it's this. It's the fire department that calls in and says, okay, this concert now needs to be shut down. And then what happens? Okay, to distract any LAPD that might be in the neighborhood, all of the good cops, what are they going to do? They have to call in a weapon that's discharged out in front of the Peterson. What are the odds somebody's going to stop right in front of the fire department, drop their gun as they open up the car door, pick up the gun, fire up a couple of rounds into the air right in front of the fire department, and then drive off? Now, do you think the fire department's not going to call that in? Of course they are. And he's now headed down, this driver is heading down Wilshire Boulevard. He's heading east. And what does he do? All units that are in the vicinity of Wilshire Boulevard and the Peterson Automotive Museum are now drawn to follow this guy. We got to catch him. He just fired a gun into the air. Okay, so they're drawing all of the police away. Now, one of the things that Death Row Records was known for was having this extra layer of security that were helpful to avoid any legal entanglements. That extra layer of security was off book. They weren't paid for by any company check by Death Row Records or a company check by Right Way. They were paid cash. And what did they do? They monitored police frequencies to know when there was going to be a response. And then they derailed the investigations because what they did is they turned the system on itself. Okay? There was no investigation into the El Rey killing of Kelly Jamerson at the El Rey Theater. Why? Because there were too many officers that were working off duty as security that night that witnessed the murder all of their careers would have been jeopardized if it was found out that they were a witness to the murder, or maybe even an accessory to the murder. And so that was one of the things Death Row Records was famous for. And who seems to be the technically proficient person that does the radios? Well, that seems to be David Mack. David Mack seemed to be like the communications expert. And he was a communications guy, using communications, monitoring radio frequencies and whatnot during the Bank of America robbery that he did 14 years for in federal prison. And mind you, he got to keep the money. That money was never found. He never had to give up his accomplices, even though they figured out who at least one of them was, and probably both. And they weren't charged. Only David Mack was charged. He got to keep the money, and he never had to give up his accomplices. I mean, that's like an unheard of deal for a corrupt cop to get. So David Mack had a pattern of being able to monitor radio frequencies, and it's the same pattern that happens the night of Biggie Smalls. And I posit that this also happened the night that Tupac and Suge were targeted. And we have the reset. The reset happens when they get pulled over. And now they don't get released until everything is set and ready to go. A lot of traffic in front of them has been allowed to leave, so now there's very little traffic. And so that's really the reset. And that's what allows them to hit the light kind of in a caravan, the way it was meant to be. Who was going to be in front, who was going to block in Suge Knight. Okay? Now with the Biggie thing, the reset happens, okay? Boom, boom, there's shots fired out in front, and the fire department is shutting down the party. We know one thing that has to happen for sure when the fire department shuts down that party. That means that Puffy and Biggie have to get into their cars and they have to leave. And we probably know where they're heading because there's another party that they want to go to. Okay, so we know that they're going to head northbound on La Cienega, right there at the, northbound on Fairfax, right there at the Peterson Automotive Museum, okay? They're gonna, I was thinking of Peterson Publishing, they're at La Cienega. The Peterson Museum is at Fairfax. So right at Fairfax and Wilshire, heading northbound, so we know where they're gonna come. Now, there are a lot of eyewitnesses to the shooting, okay? A lot of eyewitnesses to the shooting. There's a lot of eyewitnesses that see the shooter. The shooter is actually drawn, and there's an artist's rendering of it, and it does look like Amir Muhammad. And part of some of the witness testimony also is that the money that came for the shooting was done through a mortgage scheme, and that mortgage scheme spun off money, and it was money that was laundered. And Amir Muhammad happens to be a mortgage broker. I mean, you know, you can't make this stuff up. Now, David Mack, when he gets arrested for the bank robbery, the first person who visits him is Amir Muhammad, okay? Visits him, and he signs in with a fake ID and a fake Social Security number. But he does use his real name, which is just kind of, well, his real other name, and which is kind of crazy. But most people would be charged for making a false statement on a visitation form like that, and they'd go off to prison. Oh no, not Amir Muhammad. No, no, no. Harry Billups, he is not going off to prison. He gets covered by the LAPD. They cover this up. And this is what caused Russell Poole to be pushed out of the department, was him seeing that it was leading back towards LAPD police officers. Now, election night in 2016, I had a tap on the shoulder from a woman who told me that she wanted to hear about the Tupac and Biggie murders. And so I sat down with her, and about 30 minutes into our conversation, she reveals to me, oh, my father is LAPD or was LAPD. And I say, really, who's your father? She says, oh, he changed his name, but his previous name was Rafael Perez. Okay, and I said, oh, really? What does he say about this? Well, she told me that he was involved in the murders, not one, murders of Tupac and Biggie. And her big fear that night was that her father was going to end up going to prison for these murders. And she wanted me to basically calm her fears about that, which I did, because, you know, the fact is nobody wants to solve these two crimes, even though Rafael Perez has confessed to other people about these murders. Now, so who else do we have that has confessed to these murders? Well, Reggie Wright Jr. has confessed to this murder, at least the Biggie murder he's confessed to. I think he's dry snitched on himself in other ways about the Tupac thing in so many different ways, but he definitely confessed to the Biggie murder, and we get that third hand through Mario Hammonds. And Mario Hammonds has a conversation with Suge Knight, so this is where the third hand comes in. Reggie confesses to it to Suge Knight. Suge Knight says this is what happened and talks about how it was all handled by radios and cell phones, and it was done by LAPD cops. Okay, so anyway, this is a tight-knit circle of friends, and it all goes back to the original crime that these guys committed, was that they stole the evidence out of the evidence locker at LAPD Pacific Division, where Officer Kevin Gaines was working, and he had access to the Pacific Division locker. Now, these guys were not stupid, okay? They knew when they could go and approach that locker. There were cameras that got installed into that locker afterwards, but when that evidence went missing, and we have evidence that Reggie was talking about that evidence going missing, that's in documents that were part of the Wallace civil trial. Reggie's talking about how that evidence got stolen, and that he was not worried that this was going to end in an acquittal for Snoop because the evidence did go missing. In the trial itself, David Kenner makes a big deal about the evidence and almost mocks them because he knows they're not going to be able to find it. And in the trial, they try and turn up the evidence locker looking for it, and they can't find it. And after they knew that the evidence had been stolen, they installed security cameras into that Pacific Division locker. And so that's Kevin Gaines, how he kind of comes into this story. Now, how does David Mack come into this story? Well, there was a big thing, if you noticed, on the Fox program with Soledad O'Brien and Ice-T. They were, you had Suge Knight and Reggie arguing about who knew Rafael Perez and David Mack. Well, why were those guys arguing about it? Why was it a big contention? Well, I'll tell you why it was a big contention, because these guys are all involved in both the Tupac and Biggie murders. Kevin Gaines, Rafael Perez, David Mack, involved in both murders, just like Rafael Perez's daughter told me. Okay? And so it becomes a big issue, because how did David Mack get introduced to Death Row Records? Well, turns out he was introduced to Death Row Records through Reggie Wright, and we have documentation on that as well. Okay, so it's interesting because Reggie Wright is being given huge breaks in his case, and I think why that is, at least what I've been told, is that they're giving him huge breaks in his case because he keeps getting on YouTube and talking. And the more he talks, the more he reveals, and the more he reveals, why would they ever put him away quick when they can continue to get information? And keep in mind, too, that his phones are tapped right now, so that everybody that's calling and talking to him, all of those phone calls are being recorded. And so this is what's happening right now. And so back to these three players in this. You have Kevin Gaines. Let's talk about Kevin Gaines. Who is Kevin Gaines? Worked at Pacific Division at LAPD, got the evidence. There's also evidence in the Snoop murder trial that witnesses were intimidated by LAPD and Compton police, and those witnesses did not show up and testify. One of those witnesses was so intimidated that moved to Houston to take some kind of a record contract. I don't know who could have arranged that, a record contract for a witness. That sounds kind of cool. Well, so back to Kevin Gaines. Kevin Gaines was known for beating his wife, okay? There were domestic disputes that happened. When the police officer showed up to tell his wife that he had been killed, what happened? The neighbor said, "Oh, is Kevin beating his wife again?" And then what happened when the officer actually comes and tells the wife that Kevin is dead? The wife says, "Oh, Suge Knight's people must have done this." Okay, this is pretty interesting because Suge Knight himself, from October 22nd of 1996, October 22nd of 1996, Suge Knight is arrested for a probation violation. So Suge Knight was in jail at the time that the Biggie murder happened, and he was also in jail at the time that the Kevin Gaines murder happened, and I think we can call it a murder now. So there's Officer Stallworth and Officer Henderson that know that this is a murder at the time, and they're doing everything they can to get to the bottom of the murder of Kevin Gaines. Now we walk back to August of 1996. Kevin Gaines makes a phone call from the phone booth that is right next to where he ends up getting killed, and he calls 911 and he reports, you know, some kind of a shooting or what have you up at Sharitha's home. And then he runs up there, and when the police arrive, he's there. And what do? They detain him, they put him in handcuffs. He's belligerent, he's yelling at them. He's got on his car, "It's okay, IA," meaning it's okay, I'm internal affairs. And who was running internal affairs at the time? It was Police Chief Bernard Parks. Okay, so there's a complaint that gets written by Kevin Gaines for how he's treated. There are the officers' accounts of how they treated him, and there's a lawsuit that gets filed against LAPD. And the fact of the matter is that Kevin Gaines was scheduled to be terminated the very next day after he was killed. He was going to be terminated by LAPD. Now, in his file are the domestic calls. In his file also some road rage things, some of which I'm not sure are real, some of which might have been manufactured after the fact to build up this case that there was road rage. Because I take Derwin Henderson and Stallworth at their word that they believe that it was a murder. And even Russell Poole, when Frank Liga had his meltdown, kind of shook his head and said, "Hey, if I'd have known that Frank Liga knew exactly who he was shooting at the time he shot him, I would never have cleared this case." So who is it that works on the case to clear Kevin Gaines? It's Lieutenant at the time, Albanese. Who is Lieutenant Albanese? He is one of the cops that RJ and Russell handed the confession letter to. So he was the lead guy on the Kevin Gaines investigation, or the Kevin Gaines murder investigation, okay, where Officer Frank Liga was cleared. Now, so let's get back to the Biggie Smalls murder, and then we'll circle back to a few other things. In the Biggie Smalls murder, it was Kevin Gaines who was supposed to block in. He was supposed to block in Puffy, and he failed at that. Okay, he was driving a white Jeep. Okay, There were 3 men that ran from the neighborhood, and they were shouting that they needed to get the hell out of there. And there was a witness that called it in, and they got into a white Jeep. There was a witness at a cafe nearby that heard 4 men sitting around a table talking about the murder of Biggie, and they called that in. And that eyewitness talked about how they were there talking about how they had killed Biggie, and they had overheard that conversation. This is all evidence about what happened that night. Now, you also have a statement that's made by Reggie Wright to Kevin Hackey that they are going to get Biggie for the murder of Tupac. They're going to get even with him. This is made by Reggie Wright Jr., and that's part of the case file, the Wallace case file. And there is a 70-page report from that's done by the Standards Bureau at LAPD, and it's of Reggie Wright Jr.'s criminal history. And that report is suppressed in the Wallace civil trial. They keep asking for it. They keep telling them they're going to give it to him. They're going to give it to him. From 2002 all the way until 2007, they kept asking for that report and getting stonewalled. And finally, at the conclusion, there was a promise made that they were going to actually solve the case. And there was a settlement that was made because everybody was tired for 5 years of fighting over this. And finally, they said, look, we will really redouble our efforts and we will find the killers in the Wallace civil trial. And then right after they settled, the entire operation was completely shut down. That task force that Greg Kading was involved in was never allowed to see any of the Wallace civil trial documents. And they shut it down immediately after the Wallace civil trial settled. And the one report that they never gave to the Wallace civil trial people was the Reggie Wright Jr. criminal history report, a 70-page document that was compiled by LAPD. Now, who were the tight people here? Reggie Wright Jr. was tight with Rafael Perez, David Mack, and Kevin Gaines. Those were all running buddies. They hung out together. There were at least 20 death row events that they were all seen at. And for many years, Suge didn't know that Kevin Gaines and Sharitha were dating. He had no idea. Now, there is a report, and it's part of the documents that I have, that there was a hole in the desert that Sharitha and Kevin Gaines were driven to recently in a live stream. I haven't actually heard it, but I've been told that she confirmed that they were actually driven to a hole in the desert. And Kevin Gaines and Sharitha pleaded for his life. And it's also been said by Roderick Reed that the death row police were responsible for Kevin Gaines' murder. So there's a lot of evidence. These are, and when I'm telling you something, I am telling you things because, look, I wasn't there. I wasn't at the Peterson Automotive Museum. I wasn't at the MGM. I wasn't at Koval and Flamingo when this stuff happened. All we can do is look at the metadata, and the metadata points to who was involved in these murders. So back to similarities in these murders. We have the set point that happens. That's number one. Okay, the clock gets set. In the Biggie thing, it was, we got to close down the museum, the party's over, we know they're going to leave. We have the gunfire to draw the cops off, okay? With the Tupac murder, it's the cops that pull over Tupac and Suge. That's the reset. Everything's ready to roll when the reset happens, and now everything's in place to execute these two murders, okay? So there's distraction by women on the left side of both of these vehicles. Women are distracting hey, there's nothing like some hot chicks with a group of horny guys, which, I mean, let's face it, all men are horny, right? We see hot chicks on one side, we're going to be checking them out. What's going on the other side? It's the oldest trick in the book. It's distraction while the murder's happening, okay? And it happens in both cases. So we have chicks on one side of the vehicle, we have shooter on the other side of the vehicle. And that also makes witnesses maybe not recall what they had seen because they didn't really look that well. It all happens so quickly, okay? We have a shooter that rolls up on the right-hand side in both murders. We have blocked-in cars in both murders. We have an experience modification. The first murder, the car gets completely shot up. The second murder is with a professional shooter who shoots a very tight pattern, knows who he's after, and kills Biggie Smalls. Biggie is dead right after that. 5 bullets, okay? And then what do we also have? We have a Rafael Perez who is on duty at the time of the Biggie Smalls murder. And where is he? He is at the Peterson Automotive Museum. What? Really? Yes. Rafael Perez is at the Peterson Automotive Museum, and what does he do? He goes over and he kicks the shell casings and disrupts the murder scene and taints the evidence, and then he secures the scene. Okay? He's on duty at the time. David Mack, 2 days before, or a day before the bank robbery and the day of the bank robbery, he takes personal days. At the Christopher Wallace, Biggie Smalls murder, the day before he takes a personal day, the day of he takes a personal day. Exact same pattern in both murders. There are eyewitnesses that said they were both at the scene of the Peterson the day before and the day of, both Rafael Perez and David Mack. Okay, they're there. I think it's the exact same pattern in that you have radios, okay? The radios are monitoring police frequencies so we know who's around. You have an observation point in both cases that's can be seen where they can see what's happening, and somebody's on that radio coordinating everything. What Mario Hammond says is that Reg coordinated everything with radios and cell phones. Who's monitoring the radios? Probably David Mack. He was good at that. That's probably what he was doing. That's speculation on my part, but there's other metadata that suggests he's the one that's monitoring the radios. There are other similarities too in these cases. Glock 40, 9mm being used. There are multiple guns in the Tupac murder, but that becomes an experience modification. When David Mack is arrested for the bank robbery, they find Gecko ammunition in David Mack's house. And Gecko ammunition is what was used in this. A lot of people will tell you that Gecko is very common. No, there's only 2 distributors in the entire United States that have Gecko ammunition. And Gecko ammunition is something that police do not like. It's armor-piercing ammunition. Police officers, when they meet somebody that has armor-piercing ammunition, they are very harsh on them because they don't like anybody that can pierce the Kevlar that they wear that can save their lives. So armor-piercing ammunition is not something that is common, and that's part of the experience modification. And here's the other thing, okay? David Mack and Rafael Perez are involved in a shooting in which they shoot through a car, and I believe it's 1993, and this was something that they were experienced in, how to shoot through a car. They knew how to do it. They had done it before. So today I'm dropping this video It is the anniversary of the Christopher Wallace murder, and I want to give a shout out to the family, to all of the fans of Christopher Wallace, and to all of the fans of Tupac. My understanding from talking to people that I know is that the beef between Tupac and Christopher Wallace had been resolved prior to Tupac being murdered. And they were planning on getting together and collaborating and doing things in the future. So this whole East Coast, West Coast thing was hyped. The fact that, Christopher Wallace was somehow responsible for Tupac Shakur's murder, I think is complete and total BS. And clearly we know who's involved in both of these murders. And by the way, I've been told by somebody who's a relative who was involved in both of these murders. And so as we start to compile the rest of this metadata, we're going to get a much, much clearer picture about all of the reasons why we know exactly what happened these two nights. And I wanted to focus today on the Christopher Wallace murder because it is his anniversary of his passing. And shout out to all of those people who loved him. I know you guys, missed some great music and some great friendship, and it's not to be taken lightly.